The purpose of this talk is to introduce a novel and mostly unfamiliar grammatical construction, which I will refer to as macrocategorial absolute construct phrasal alternations. A macrocategorial absolute construct phrasal alternation, or MACPA for short, is a morphological alternation satisfying the following two conditions. First, that it is macrocategorial, that is to say, it applies to most words in the language. And secondly, that it consists minimally of two forms, an absolute form, whose prototypical functions are associated with final phrasal positions, and a construct form whose prototypical functions are associated with pre-final phrasal positions. What got me interested in macrocategorial absolute construct phrasal alternations was the observation that there seems to be a rather abstract parallelism between processes of ablaut in certain Malaic dialects of Central Sumatra on the one hand, and on the other hand, processes primarily of metathesis but also of consonant insertion in a number of languages of the Circum-Timor area. The work presented in this paper all relies on secondary sources and focuses on the 7 languages shown in the first column of the table in the present slide. Tanjung Paumu Dik Kerinci is described in a dissertation by Tim McKinnon. Amphoan Meto, as described by Kirsten Culhane. Amarasi Meto, as described by Owen Edwards. Helong, as also mentioned in the same study by Owen Edwards, relying on some secondary sources. Letty, as described in a book by Ona van Engelenhoven. Roma, as described by Lee Anthony Stephen. And finally, South Mumbai, as described in a study by Helem Andressa de Oliveira Fogassa. What's remarkable about macrocategorial absolute construct phrasal alternations is their abstract nature and the fact that they are realized by phonological substances of quite different nature: ablaut, consonant insertion, and metathesis. The way in which these different phonological substances are manifest in the different languages is indicated in the final 2 columns. So for Kerinci, ablaut forms a distinction between absolute and oblique forms, characteristic of almost all words in the language. In Amphoan Meto, consonant insertion distinguishes between an absolute form formed by consonant insertion and a construct form characterized by the absence of such consonant insertion, and the remaining 5 languages by metathesis, but with a twist. In the first 3 languages, the absolute form is the unmetathesized form, while the construct form is the metathesized one. While in the remaining 2 languages, it's the absolute form that is metathesized, while the construct form is the unmetathesized form. Whereas formally, MACPAs involve a wide range of different phonological and morphological processes, in terms of their functions, they exhibit a remarkable unity involving 3 main families of functions which may be characterized as basic, syntactic, and discourse. The basic function of MACPAs is to distinguish between a citation form, which may also occur in certain other typically phrase-final syntactic environments, and a pre-final form, which, as its name suggests, typically occurs in non-final positions. The syntactic function of MACPAs consists primarily of affecting a distinction between predication and attribution, So what MACPers do in this case is to distinguish between the subject of a predication and the head of an attributive construction. Finally, the discourse function of MACPers involves a distinction between what might be characterized following Millsark and others as weak and strong pragmatic functions, whereby weak functions are generally unmarked, indefinite, and unresolved. I use here terms that have been proposed by various other sources in describing these functions, as contrasted with associative, definite, and resolved functions, which are characteristic of strong discourse functions. So what we see here then is that the MACPer basically provides a uniform mode of expression for functions of very different kinds, ranging from the distinction between citation and non-citation forms through syntactic to discourse functions. And the way this is done is indicated in this table, which shows us that basically, in most cases, and these are the cases indicated in red, the left-hand column is associated with the absolute form, while the right-hand column is associated with the construct form. Though, as you can see by some of the cells indicated in black, there are certain deviations from this ideal pattern. Up to now, the discussion has been very abstract, and I'm sure many of us are eager to see some real-life examples of MACPers. So for the remainder of this talk, what we'll do is provide examples illustrating the notion of MACPer, beginning with the Tanjung Pao Mudik dialect of Kerinci. Although the focus of this talk is on the functions of MACPers, it's worth dwelling briefly also on their forms for the simple reason that they are so dazzlingly Baroque in many cases. The table you see here is what a speaker of the Tanjung Pao Mudik dialect of Kerinci must know in order to inflect words in the language. What we see, for example, is that the word for mouth, which in the absolute form is mulat, because the final line is an AK, it alternates with the construct form ik. Words in Kerinci come in two phonological classes. The default class is that of K words. However, many words are members of the second G word class, which basically consists of words where somewhere in the word there is a voiced obstruent, B, D, or G. So the word for salt begins with a G, therefore it is a G word, and therefore it exhibits the alternation indicated here between gah in the absolute and gahung in the construct form. In this slide, we see two examples of the alternation applying to the word for door, which is pintiao in the absolute and pintieu in the construct case. What we see in examples 1 and 2 are the syntactic and the discourse functions, respectively, of the MACPer alternation. So in 1, the absolute form marks the construction as a whole as being predicative, whereas in 1b, the construct form marks the otherwise identical construction as being possibly predicative, possibly attributive. The option is due to certain other functions of the MACPer construction, which I simply won't have time to go into here. But the bottom line is that in 1, the alternation is marking the distinction between a predicative construction and possibly an attributive one. What we see in 2 is something totally different. What we see in 2 is that the distinction between the absolute and the construct forms of the word for door basically serve to mark a distinction which Tim McKinnon in his work characterizes as being definite, as is suggested by the English translations, a door versus the door. For reasons which I won't have time to go into here, I prefer to characterize this alternation as being between an unmarked form and an associative form. Associative in the sense that the form Pintyo in 2b basically has the meaning door associated with some x. But this corresponds very closely to the definite interpretation, and we need not dwell on the difference between these two different analyses here. So basically, this is really strange, isn't it? Why should the same form, or the same alternation, mark the distinction between predicative and attributive in one case, but the distinction between unmarked and associative or definite in another case? Just to give you one more example of the latter function, in example 3, what we see is the same alternation with a very similar function, but here applying to a word that denotes an activity. So the word to climb, nahe in the absolute, nahe in the construct form, has a similar function, climbing versus climbing it. So it marks the distinction between an unmarked form and an associative form, which here in the English translation, to which I wouldn't attach too much importance, is captured in terms of the presence of a definite direct object pronoun. So what we see here is something that is really puzzling, and there have been several studies of Kerinci dialects which are basically all address the question, what's the connection between these different functions? And I think the most common approach that has been adopted by a number of researchers is basically to say that these functions are unrelated. It's just one of those things about Kerinci morphology, that you've got this alternation that does all sorts of very different things. So much for Kerinci. But let's move on now to the Timor region, and let's look at Amphoan Meto. And as you can see, Amphoan Meto, well, in fact, like all of the languages considered here, also has an alternation between absolute and construct forms with basic syntactic and discourse functions, which are remarkably similar except for a twist. As you can see in the final two columns here, in Amphoan Meto, unlike in Kerinci, it's the construct form that is weak and the absolute form that is strong. So let's look at some data from Amphoan Meto. In 4, what we see, in fact, in a cleaner fashion than we saw in Kerinci, is how consonant insertion basically distinguishes between the subject of a predication and, in its absence, the head of an attributive form. So Fafi pig plus z as opposed to plain Fafi. The details of consonant insertion are again really Baroque, and Kirsten Culhane deals with this at length. We just don't have time to go into it here. So again, we have the same predicative attributive distinction, just as in Kerinci, and quite remarkably, the same alternation between a zero form and a consonant inserted form also marks the distinction between indefinite and definite, typically, not exclusively, but typically in phrase final position. So drink versus drink it, recall climb versus climb it in Kerinci. So we have this, again, remarkable connection between the predicative attributive distinction and the indefinite-definite distinction, both of which are brought together and expressed in terms of a single morphological device, namely the MACPA, but with a twist that the mapping here is chiastic in the sense that it's in Amphoran Meto, it's the indefinite that goes with the attributive and the definite that goes with the predicative, whereas it was the other way around in Kerinci, which in fact, in the case of MACPAs, reflects the most common mapping between the syntactic and the discourse functions. We'll look at just one more example of MACPAs, this time from the Amarasi dialect of Meto as described by Owen Edwards. Amarasi exhibits a glitch in the citation form which, while sometimes occurring in the expected absolute, occasionally occurs also in the less expected construct form. But other than that, it exhibits the same pattern that we saw in Tanjung Pau Mudik Kerinci, which is the default pattern for MACPAs, whereby the absolute construct alternation in the syntax marks a distinction between predicative and attributive constructions, while in the discourse marks a distinction between weak and strong functions, which Owen Edwards characterizes as unresolved versus resolved. In 6, what we see is the predicative-attributive distinction marked by metathesis. The unmetathesized form fatu marking the subject of a predication, the metathesized form fa'ut marking the head of an attribution. 7 constitutes a simple dialogue provided by Owen Edwards, consisting of a question-answer pair. He characterized the question as being unresolved, the answer as being resolved, and the difference between them, once again, is in terms of metathesis between the unmetathesized be'i and the metathesized be'i. As you can see, the metathesis involves the e vowel and the glottal stop in the final syllable. So up to now, we've seen examples of MACPAs in 3 languages, Kerinci and 2 varieties of Meto. For reasons of time, we won't be able to look at examples from the remaining 4 languages in the table. Be that as it may, what we've shown then is that MACPAs, in spite of their superficial phonological and morphophonemic diversity, actually present a rather fundamental unity in terms of their functions in 2 quite different parts of the Austronesian-speaking world, in central Sumatra and in the Circum-Timor region. Now, while the definition of MACPA involves the 2 conditions presented in this slide, it also seems to be the case that MACPAs possess an array of further properties which I refer to here as contingent, meaning that they're not part of the definition, but they seem to be characteristic of MACPAs, and I leave open the question whether they are always present in MACPAs or whether their presence here is an accidental product of the examples that we looked at. One is that they apply to the final syllables of words, be it through ablaut, final consonant insertion, or metathesis. They're phonologically baroque, and an additional point which I didn't mention so far is that they exhibit extreme dialectal microvariation. So you could literally walk for 10 or 20 minutes in the Kerinci Valley in central Sumatra, and you get completely different phonological alternations, still providing instantiations of MACPA. Similarly, different varieties of Meto exhibit quite different patterns of metathesis and consonant insertion. In the time that's remaining, I'd like to dwell on briefly on possible diachronic sources for MACPers. And the primary diachronic source, I would like to argue, consists in phonological phrase-final alternations. Consider a string of units indicated here with X, where X could be syllable, word, or foot. Pass them into phonological phrases, as indicated here. What phrase-final phonology does is to mark the distinction between the final X in each constituent and all of the pre-final X's. So what we get then is a distinction between medial and final, which may be realized by different phonological features in different languages. So what I'd like to argue then is that MACPers are basically a grammaticalization of such phrase-final phonology. I'll present briefly some examples of phrase-final phonology that has not yet undergone grammaticalization into MACPers. These come from varieties of Malay and Indonesian. If we look at the phrase satu kali, one time, what we find in 4 different varieties of Malay and Indonesian is 4 different phenomena, 4 different phonological processes which distinguish between medial and final positions. What we see is metathesis in Kupang Malay, hardly a coincidence that Kupang Malay is spoken on the island of Timor. What we see is the insertion of a final glottal stop in Jakarta, Indonesian, insertion of a nasal followed by pre-oralization in Dusun Baru in central Sumatra, insertion of a final engma in Pasir Sabalah, which is a village just outside the city of Padang in West Sumatra. So to the extent that this scenario is valid, one might paraphrase Talmi Givon's famous dictum that today's morphology is yesterday's morphology, in order to conclude that in some cases, today's morphology might actually be yesterday's phrasal phonology. In conclusion then, what we've seen in this paper is that MACPers occur in 2 relatively remote parts of Indonesia, namely Central Sumatra and the Circum-Timor region. This raises the question whether MACPers can be found in other parts of the Austronesian-speaking or Papuan world, or even further afield. So far, I have reason to believe that MACPers might also exist in Rotuman, based on descriptions of metathesis, and in Southern Min, based on quite a few discussions of tone sandy. Now, do Sumatra, Timor, Rotuman, and Southern Min constitute a macro-linguistic area? I don't know. How common are MACPers in other parts of the world? Again, I don't know, though I suspect that they're actually not quite common and that MACPers may in fact constitute a characteristic feature of languages spoken in the greater Indonesian region. Though, of course, this must be left open to future research. Thank you.